Welcome to the Unlocking Victorian Justice podcast series about the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. We hope that VALS Justice Yarns will help you learn about the Royal Commission and the urgent work that we must do to end Aboriginal deaths in custody. Please follow our social media, which is linked in the description underneath this recording. And if you'd like to support the work that VALS does, please donate at vals.org.au/donate. That's vals.org.au/DONATE. Hello and welcome everyone to the VALS Justice Yarn podcast. I acknowledge and respect the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land that the VALS Preston office is located on. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who are involved with VALS and work with us, and more broadly, those elders and community members who fight to achieve justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people every day. Wherever you are listening to this in Australia, you are on unceded land. Sovereignty has never been ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. A warning for our listeners today: we will be discussing Aboriginal deaths in custody and some of the detail may be distressing. We encourage Victorian Mob to call VALS Yarning Safe and Strong hotline on 1800 959 563 if you would like to speak with someone. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this podcast may include the names of deceased persons. For this episode, I am speaking with Leanne Carter, who is VALS statewide community justice programs leader. Leanne Carter is a Wiradjuri and Noongar woman, and under the CJP programs that she leads, there are a number of key justice support programs. That includes the Buggarook Transitional Housing for women who are being released from prison. And we also have CSOs, client services officers across the regions in Victoria and specifically focusing on family violence. Within Leanne's team also sits community legal education and the Aboriginal Community Justice Reports Project. Thank you for joining me today, Leanne, and welcome.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to the elders past and present and the elders that are listening today and our future generation, and to say that this land was and always will be Aboriginal land and sovereignty has never been ceded.
So Leanne, we're doing a mini series of podcasts and we're talking about the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and the unfinished work of governments across Australia to implement those 339 recommendations of the Commission. Particularly, I would like to talk about Recommendation 90A, which stated that where police bail is denied to an Aboriginal person or granted on terms the person cannot meet, the Aboriginal Legal Service or a person nominated by the service is to be notified of that fact. In Victoria, we at VALS are the organisation that police need to notify. However, these notifications require a number of resources, and particularly during the COVID pandemic, we've seen an increase in notifications without a corresponding increase in government funding to assist with handling this increase in notifications. In our COVID-19 recovery plan, Building Back Better, we recommended that in order to meet the identified increased need for and demand on VALS custody notification service, the Community Justice Project should receive increased funding. Leanne, can you talk about what an average day is for a custody notification officer at VALS and how that's changed during the pandemic?
Absolutely. I think the first thing our custody notification officers would tell you is that there's no normal day. Nothing ever goes to plan, as we know. However, on average at the moment, our client notification program is receiving a very high volume of notifications. So we're getting roughly at least 36 notifications coming in a day. And that's not including the number of people that are already currently on remand. And that's normally between 15 and 22 people already. So what we're seeing is a number of people that are coming into custody, not only with complex needs and comorbidity issues, However, they're coming in really quite unwell into their cells. So people are experiencing a lot higher mental health issues and a lot more medical conditions. And this is obviously because there's a lot more lack of support within communities. A lot of organisations are really restricted in what services they can provide, and that significantly impacted on the supports that community members have found. What we've noticed during the COVID pandemic is the number of people that are coming into custody that are attempting self-harm or have some suicidal ideations have been 5 times as many as what we had in our previous annual year. What we're noticing is big increases within Ambulance Victoria being called, police having to use sections under the Mental Health Act and to actually keep people in custody, and people being taken through to the hospital. Unfortunately, the stark reality of the issues that we're dealing with are quite confronting for our client notifications officers, but they're obviously very confronting for the family members that we know sit behind those community members and trying to support them as well. During the pandemic, our community justice programs, in particular our client notification officers, increased the number of welfare checks that we're doing on people that are in custody. So, for example, last year we had around 13,000 notifications, and as a result of that number, we made nearly 47,500 calls, and that was contact calls, that was welfare calls, that was follow-up. So we've doubled the number of welfare checks that we're currently undertaking on people in custody. And what we're finding is the more we're sort of digging, the bigger the issues are. And when we started to increase these welfare checks, we got a lot of pushback from police. Police don't like doing paperwork, and they don't appear to like taking calls from our client notification officers sometimes as well. So the response that we're getting is, why are you calling? You're always calling. They're sleeping. Why do you have to keep calling? And our point of view is that, we're obviously going through our welfare checks. We're going to continue to call, because part of calling is ensuring the cultural safety and, making sure that person knows that we're overlooking what's happening there, and that we're here if they need to speak to us. So, the big thing about that is pointing out to them that, we're trying to prevent deaths in custody, and they either work with us or, they're working against us. It was the attitudes that the staff and myself were receiving that our welfare checks equated to some form of special treatment, and therefore us ringing up to actually check on, people that we knew were coming down off of substances and had been homeless, and perhaps had had the kids taken a few months earlier, or, had just lost a family member and they were really struggling. Those checks to ensure that person's safety were perceived as being special treatment, or that person just identified as Aboriginal because, they knew that we'd call, or to make it easier to have bail. So we're still facing some really systemic racist attitudes within the police force, and even through some of the reforms and that have been made since the recommendations, it doesn't go far enough to actually be embedded properly within all the policies and procedures within the Victorian Police. And unfortunately, it's something we're continuing to have to raise. And we do continue to raise it. We continue to identify particular issues and trends across the board. So, for example, what we were noticing more recently is that we found police are actually questioning people's identity and going into the cells and asking them, where's your mob, where are you from? And if that person's not giving that white police officer, what is a satisfactory answer, then they're deeming them not to be Aboriginal. Now, the impact on that means it's also not taken into account when that person goes for bail, which is very significant given that the Bail Act was amended to identify our community members, our Aboriginal community members, as a class of vulnerable people. So these issues, of which the Royal Commission was initially meant to provide around having the access at the most appropriate time to legal advice and ensuring the cultural safety of Aboriginal people in order to reduce suicide and self-harming within police cells, still exists today. And, there's been a lot of discussion around, we're nearly up to 500 people that have died in custody since the recommendation. No police officer has been, found to be held criminally responsible. And we often hear there's a lot of distrust around the system because police are investigating police. And one of the things that VALS in particular and many people support is having an independent body to actually oversee the police complaints and the processes when we know they fail. Because when they fail, that's why we've got deaths in custody, because procedures weren't followed, because proper medical assistance wasn't given. And one of the biggest things, as we know, within the outcomes of the RCIADIC commission, was that police culture was identified to be, the contributing factor for people actually ending up in custody.
So Leanne just had to pause our interview because she received a custody notification call. So I think it's just really telling how 24/7 that role is, and the fact that VALS staff is always available to assist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been picked up by police. And listening to you talk about your experience and your team's experiences today, Leanne, has made me really reflect on whether this Royal Commission recommendation has been properly implemented, and whether it's a case of more could be done to ensure that the protections that the Royal Commission had hoped would flow from implementing this recommendation have really been achieved. Obviously, the context has changed with COVID. There's been an increased number of calls that you're receiving. You've expanded your welfare checks to the prison system as well. The people who are calling through have much more acute needs and more urgent needs. One of the criticisms of governments across Australia is that they've overstated the extent to which the recommendations of the Royal Commission have actually been implemented. So if you're able to reflect on your views on where we stand in terms of the status of this particular recommendation.
I think you've hit on the head when you say that they've overstated, what part of the recommendations that they've implemented, and that they feel that perhaps they've done enough, and they haven't done enough. If they'd done enough, we'd have, we'd be seeing the numbers of people in custody reducing. We'd be seeing the number of people that are dying in custody reducing. We'd be seeing much more protective factors of proper care and medical care and that intervention taking place without having necessarily, 3 or 4 different sort of accountability factors just to make sure that police are doing their job right. As for the recommendations going far enough, no, they haven't been embedded enough. There's never been any police, officer held criminally responsible for any of the actions. And if we can put targets on things like getting our COVID numbers down and, hitting a certain target and things like that, then the government can be just as responsive to actually implement real targets with committed strategies and implements and consultations with community. And the first thing they need to do is actually go back and look at the closing the gap justice targets and review them, get real. Like we set ourselves, every year people come up with these New Year's resolutions, so to speak, and people reach their targets, but the people sitting in government can't actually set proper targets. I mean, as I said, I just think that if we can do it with COVID, we can do it with other things, then why can't we set a number and just say, okay, this is where we want to be, this is where we need to go.
If you don't mind, perhaps could you speak about your experience at VALS? What is it like working at an Aboriginal community controlled organisation as an Aboriginal person, working with Aboriginal people in incredibly difficult circumstances?
I think the thing I like most about my job is working with community. And I've been at VALS for 10 years this year, and I've worked in various roles throughout the organisation. And the one thing I really love is actually getting to work with community. And, sometimes we hear about people wanting to fix things or save things. And it's like, you know what? We don't need you fixing or saving us. We're a pretty resilient mob. You know what I mean? But it's the opportunity to actually work with community and empower and educate community around what their rights are. And, I think that's a really important thing, is whether we teach our kids that, or, we're teaching others that, is the ability to be able to feel confident and stand up for what's right, what's wrong, but understand what your rights are. So I'd have to say that would be the thing I enjoy the most, is community work. Being able to engage with a mob, or, knowing someone's coming in and seeing me drinking less than what they did the week before, and they've had a few more feeds. It's that really practical sort of stuff. It's not, neatly tying things up in a nice little bowl, and, because reality just, people's lives get in the way, and, all these other things, as we know, get in the way. So I don't mind messy. I don't mind the mess. The more complicated the client, the more challenging I find it. But I think, the simple rewards that we find is knowing that someone feels much better after yarning with us. Someone knows where they can go get help. And, we've got a whole mob that keep coming back to our community justice staff to get help when they need it. And some of these fellows are pretty proud, and they won't go to other places to get assistance. But the fact that we know they come to us is, is building that relationship. So when they do get stuck at any time, they know that they can trust us and, speak with us. With working with community, obviously becomes challenges, as we know, like, there's no 9 to 5. I had a call the other weekend from a police station. I think it was 2-3 o'clock in the morning, from one of the officers, a very senior officer who had my mobile number, who was given by another police officer. And it's like, oh, Leanne, will I help you out? Ring Leanne. And, obviously when you're rolling down the supermarket, you hear, oh, sis, I missed court, or, I've got to sort this out. So, our job doesn't end at 9 to 5. And obviously, we ensure that we look after one another, and, are quite conscious of, the roles we do take on. However, it can be very challenging. And I think what is challenging is knowing the experiences and what the families and the partners, are going through at the time that someone's in custody. We understand that. We've had family members in that situation ourselves. So the way we approach our work is that that person in custody is like our family member, and, we'd want to do everything for that person as what we want to do for our own family members.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for taking the time to speak with us today, and to inform the audience who'll be watching this and listening to this podcast about the role of VALS and the role of your community justice program section. And I think those sort of really unique reflections you bring with the decade of experience under your belt working in this jurisdiction to fight for justice and access to justice for all people, all Aboriginal communities across Victoria. And I think definitely a theme that is coming out across all of Australia is that these Royal Commission recommendations haven't yet been properly implemented. There's still a long way to go. And of course, since the Royal Commission, there've been, a plethora of other inquiries and coronial inquests and a range of other recommendations that haven't been implemented either. And I just want to really acknowledge your expertise and your passion when it comes to the rights of people who are detained in police stations, knowing, the extreme vulnerability of people in that position, which of course is only compounded when someone is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, or, living with disability and other, may have other characteristics that also make them particularly vulnerable. So really want to acknowledge and thank your work and your team's work in this space.
Thank you. And might I just finally say that the client notification system, whether it's, it's required across every state, but as we know, the heart and passion of the work we do is ensuring the safety of our mob that are in custody. But if the government also continues to under-resource the organisations and the ALS organisations that actually, provide those services, then, that's an issue in itself as well. So there needs to be some accountability and some proper resourcing for our Aboriginal legal services.
Absolutely, Leanne. I think when governments talk about self-determination, that really requires Aboriginal community controlled organisations to be properly funded in a sustainable way, to continue to deliver those services in a culturally appropriate and safe way for everyone.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you.
Dear listener, if you're still with us, thank you for listening. Please check out our other podcasts in the Royal Commission Anniversary Series, VALS Justice Yarns. And a reminder to follow us on social media and donate to VALS if you want to support our work. The links are below in the description. And of course, wherever you're listening to this podcast from, across this land, sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land.